Okay, well, thank you. I'm going to talk about a little different way to think about the achievement gap, and specifically the achievement gap in reading. And the language that I use comes from the language used by the U.S. Department of Ed. And that language, some of you may know, comes from the Office of Management and Budget, the ones that actually put together the federal budget, at least in an initial form. So the achievement gap, as you probably know, has been a focus of educational research for a long, long time, and arguably really popped up with the study of Coleman, and that was published in 1966. It was the first time in this country that a really large amount of data looked for differences among student groups in terms of achievement. And the difference between black and white students in the Coleman study really opened the door for a lot of focus on the so-called achievement gap, and that's a focus that continues today. I should say that the definition of the achievement gap varies depending on the authors that you read. So Gloria Ladson-Billings provides a really broad definition. So I want to be sure to acknowledge that, but I'm going to stick with what is probably a traditional definition, that in general you will find on average that white students perform higher on achievement tests like reading than black students. Now, historically, when you have data on black and white students, the achievement gap has been represented as a standardized mean difference. Many of you will recognize Cohen's D, where you have a sample mean for the black sample minus that for the white sample, and in the denominator you have some kind of standard deviation, more generically called a standardizer. Okay? The achievement gap in reading is about 3/4 of a standard deviation in favor of white students. That's the equivalent of about 4 years of learning in middle school. So you would say on average white students are scoring about 3/4 of a standard deviation higher than black students. One of the really interesting things that has happened in this country in the past 30 years was captured by Reardon, who pointed out that today that the achievement gap for SES is about twice as large as that for race. 50 years ago, that was almost reversed. But nonetheless, there's an achievement gap by race. So one of the sort of premise here is that those of you that have taken statistics courses, whether it is recent or like me many, many years ago, you went through ANOVA. And one of the things you learn about education and psychology is that in terms of statistics, everything centers on means, because we're always interested in averages. But variances actually can be an important way to capture those students who are not average. And so in a so-called randomized design where you have treatment control, you know that subjects are assigned at random. And if you find a mean difference that favors treatment, you often find that the variance for that treatment group is larger than the variance for the control group. What does that mean? It means that a treatment that works on average doesn't necessarily work for all of the cases or subjects in the treatment group. And that's called a treatment by subject interaction. This also applies to so-called quasi-experimental designs, which would encompass a comparison of black and white groups. So regardless of the presence or absence of mean differences, equal variances imply that, yes, subjects, or in this specific instance, black students, white students, responded similarly with respect to their mean, whereas unequal variances implies something different. So here's an example that's really the focus that looks at black and white students who have different means and different variances. And I actually simulated these data to try to make the point using the NAEP measure. This is the official measure of educational progress in the US. And because it's a quasi-experimental design, I put together a model, statistical model, that had race, black, white, and a measure of SES. Because when you start comparing the reading achievement of black and white samples, you want to be sure to try, to the extent possible, to remove the impact of confounders. And SES is arguably an important confounder. So here's what the plot looks like. And in general, the blue would represent the black sample, the green, the white sample. And 250, this is the mean on the NAEP particular measure that I used to kind of frame the problem. But the green sample, the white sample, has a mean that's about 3/4 of a standard deviation higher than that of the black sample. So I made that happen by simulating the data using a computer program. The more relevant point is, look at the distribution of the scores, or in this case residuals, but we can think about them as sort of adjusted scores. In these two samples, out in the tails. So here's an example. In this hypothetical black sample, these represent students whose performance was well below the average reading performance of the black students. What the argument for looking at variances implies is, I need to go look at those students. I need to extract them from the data file, which is easy to do, and I need to do some, it's kind of statistical detective work. Who are they? I may find out, for example, that these are students who have moved within or between school districts a lot in the last 2 or 3 years. Or I may find out that these are students who disproportionately come from households that participate in federal programs like the WIC program, Women, Infants, and Children program. Okay? But the point is to say that the average for in this example, the black sample, is lower than that of the white sample isn't sufficient. There's insight to be gained by looking at performances in the tails. So go to the upper end here. There's a number of, in this example, black students who actually scored above the mean for the white students. I think you might want to be interested in those folks. Who are they? Once again, you pull them out and try to figure out, maybe these are students who, for example, come from 2-parent households. Maybe these are students who disproportionately participated in community activities that support achievement, like community tutoring and things like that. And you could make exactly the same kind of argument and practice connected to sample 2. So thinking about the achievement gap in terms of variances means looking at that sort of Cohen's d and saying, what else can I learn about the students who are not at the average? And in doing that, the idea is that you can provide additional insight into the nature of that gap. And I'll just finish by saying some of the statistical procedures used a lot today, what are called clusters designs, HLM, where you have lots and lots of classrooms. And you can find out that classrooms, for example, that are overwhelmingly black and classrooms that are overwhelmingly white, maybe 25 of each, they actually have different variances. They may have different means on reading achievement, but they have different variances. I'd like to try to more formally explain why they have different variances. So I mentioned that as something that I think today is sort of increasingly possible with the availability of these larger secondary data sets. Thank you.
Thank you. And when